What is happening, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back to another week. This week, our guest is Kenny Ryan. Kenny's been doing some research on pretty much all the presidents up till, I believe, 1900. And he's going till today, but that's where he's at so far.
Yeah, and I will be the first to admit, I found out that my knowledge of presidents was painfully lacking after talking to Kenny Ryan.
I think that's most Americans.
Yeah, I mean, as we discussed in the episode, my knowledge kind of drifts off once we hit Nixon. Beyond that, I know a couple of key players.
But I think that's everyone. I think that as we talk about in the episode, we talk about how you get these big gaps of presidents that aren't really noteworthy.
No, they were just filling the seat for the time being. And we kind of go into depth with Kenny on our most recent presidents and whether or not they're going to be seat fillers or memorable.
Seat fillers.
For the most part. But we also talked to him about the history of presidential decisions and behaviors that led to the country that we live in today. So things like corporate corruption. Turns out we can point the finger at somebody for that one.
Sweet.
So let's go find out.
What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
So what are you working on lately? You have a podcast talking about this sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm the host of Abridged Presidential Histories, which is a podcast. I put up episodes twice a month. And the goal is I kind of, in chronological order, do the stories on the successes, scandals, administrations of each president in order in an hour or less. And about a year ago, I started also adding historian interviews. So I'll usually have like kind of a main narrative thrust about, this guy, that guy, they're all guys. And then I'll interview a historian, to dive into some things that are like, oh, that was really interesting. I want to learn more about it, or I didn't have a chance to get into this. And it's a lot of fun.
What made you get into this? Like,
I'm a huge nerd.
Well, yeah, join the club. Like,
I had been always enjoyed reading history and biographies anyway. I'm the guy who, like, when it came time to graduate college, they're like, congratulations, you took so many history classes for fun that you have a minor on accident. And I was like, okay, cool. And so there's this love of history that's inside me. I'm also someone who used to be a journalist. For about 5 years, I was a sports writer, news writer, mostly around Texas, also New York. And then I got, I kind of looked around one day. I was like, everyone's getting fired. Maybe I should get a new career path before, that's yanked out from under me. Got an MBA and moved up to Seattle, and now work in marketing. So the podcast is a chance to scratch that old storytelling itch, that desire to still write and tell stories. And then it marries it with my passion for history.
So how far have you gotten with presidents? You gotten all the way up to our most recent?
Right now, William McKinley is who's currently out. So we are just hitting the 20th century. I'm finishing off my Teddy Roosevelt scripts, doing a bunch of those interviews this week, actually, for historians. And so that's where I am right now. We're about to start hitting names that people recognize.
I mean, Teddy Roosevelt's pretty badass. We did an episode on him. Like, you could probably do a couple episodes on Teddy.
Oh, absolutely. Teddy Roosevelt, I'm like, there's no way this is going to fit in under 60 minutes. So let's pick like kind of a narrative thread. Like, what are the few moments I really want to focus on? And then let's also do the historian interview. So I think I have like 4 or 5 historian interviews lined up to kind of fill out that mosaic that is TR.
Yeah, he's a wild guy.
Yeah.
So what I actually kind of wanted to pick your brain on before we kind of break down how we got where we are as a country, you now have a pretty good view of what a president is and should be and what they should be doing. How do you feel about Biden at the moment?
Biden at the moment is someone who seems to be trying to do the best they can do to improve the country, given the strengths and limitations of their position. And in particular, right now, one of the big questions is, do we challenge some of those limitations? Do we flex some of these things, in particular the filibuster? The filibuster being something that is a total accidental fluke, was never supposed to exist. Nobody ever intended to invent it. It was invented on accident, and then it took people like 30 years to realize, oh, we accidentally invented that 30 years ago. Let's start using it. And so, right now there's certainly this big question of, do we challenge the filibuster? Do we get rid of that? It has certainly become a tradition. Is it a tradition that is good for democracy, or is it a tradition that's bad for democracy? So I think Biden's a guy that's struggling to figure that out. He's also certainly someone, and this is like the norm, it seems, of the last 12 years, someone who's struggling with an opposition that is a say no to everything crowd. Now they did bipartisan infrastructure, so I don't want to ignore that. That really is a big deal. That was a ton of money. That is going to have huge impacts on people's lives. It's not sexy legislation. It's not, very, very easy for you to realize where it is. It's not a check, with Biden's name on it. But they did work across the aisle, at least in the Senate. I don't think anyone in the House voted for it, which is, again, a testament to like that's the kind of thing that both parties used to come together and hash it out. And the way politics have evolved is I think, the bigger story than the presidency. Biden feels like someone who would be, in any other age, a perfectly adequate and soon forgotten president. He's not someone who's like sweeping you off your feet with oratory.
Just doing the job.
He's just doing the job. Yeah, he's just doing the job as best he can, just trying to tinker around the edges. But the circumstance he's found himself in is more high stakes and stressful. And if you look at American history, sometimes you've had adequate presidents in times like that, and maybe you wish you had somebody who had a higher level of skill that could like find the way to bridge the divide, find the way to convince the American people, which is what you got to do, to come more together. I don't think it's something where you're going to convince, say, members of the opposite party who were elected running to oppose you. You're not going to convince them because they know what got themselves elected. You have to find a way to communicate to the American people, and that's the challenge.
One thing that is related to communicating with the American people that I don't think anything is going to come of this, but there's been a lot of conversation about removing the ability of members of Congress to trade stocks. And something like 76% of the American people that they polled said, yeah, totally take that away. I agree with that, because they have a lot of information that you shouldn't be able to trade with. But I don't think any president could get that rule taken and changed.
It's one of those things. These politicians are savvy, and they realize that sure, there might be a lot of things that are overwhelmingly popular, but they're not the things that people actually vote on. They're not the things that people get out on, And so congressmen, senators of both parties, they can ignore that because they want to make money off of it. As long as they do hit the meaty issues that the people really care about. If you're a Republican, then it's things like whether it's abortion, guns, what have you. If you're a Democrat, the other side of abortion, guns, what have you. Those are the issues that really get people to vote. And so as a result, these other things that might be overwhelmingly popular with the American people, the politicians, just too many of them don't care, because they realize that they're not going to get voted out of office for not doing that.
Yeah, it's not going to do any good for them.
Yeah, the American public forgets pretty quickly about stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's just not what's on their mind when they're in the voting booth and they're looking at the names and they're deciding who to hit. Nobody is asking themselves, what is this person's position on whether congressmen can buy and sell stocks? That if they are, then they're in the voting booth way too long, and they've thought through a lot of other issues first.
Yeah, usually everyone's just a one or two policy kind of thing. It's like, oh, all right, it's either the guns or the abortion thing, or one or the other. But one thing Jerry and I were talking about, I don't feel like any of the presidents we've had in my lifetime are going to be remembered in 30, 50 years, right? They're going to be that big span of presidents where you're just like, I don't remember them for anything. I mean, unless it's something bad. Like even Clinton, I don't think Clinton's going to make it in there. Clinton, I agree. Clinton's going to be another white male president. Yeah, he's going to be a blip. 30 years. That's it. George H.W. Bush will be another white male president in 30 years. George W. Bush might be remembered just because the Iraq War was such a fuck up. I would say he might get it for 9/11, but even then, I don't think so. Because I mean, there have been other presidents that fuck shit up like that. We just don't remember them. They're forgotten. That's true. And if you're looking at the long, of like say 100 years, say 200 years, exactly. Like think that you think of like the 19th century.
what presidents can you name from the 19th century 130 years later? You can name Lincoln. You know, people might say Jefferson and Jackson if they even remember that that's the century they're from. Yep. You know, Grant's pretty popular lately. Maybe get Grant, and someone else will probably say Alexander Hamilton, and you'd be like, that's not a president. But you're right. And it's too early to say. But if we look at this era that we're in, this would probably feel like a long, kind of forgettable stretch from FDR to, you know, a bunch of kind of guys who were there. FDR certainly gets, I mean, he was a colossus. There's nobody who's been on that stage. You know, there's nobody who will be in the top 5 presidents. There's nobody who will be in the worst 5 presidents.
I mean, even if you look at Reagan and the amount of bullshit he did, I still don't think you're going to bring him up.
No, I don't think Reagan will be another kind of forgotten white guy. I agree. You know, they'll have their fanboys out there. All these old presidents have their fanboys out there, but the larger American public, you know, probably won't be aware.
They won't be teaching it in history class, you know, for sure. Like, oh, you have to remember George W. Bush because of 9/11 or he fucked up Iraq and Afghanistan. No, you're not going to remember that.
Yeah, and I'd say he'd be the one most likely to possibly be remembered, but that would be it, you know.
You might get,
and that's actually like when I approach that. It's funny. This is actually kind of one of the things that prompted my approach to my podcast. Is I was like, can I name every president in a row? Okay, I hit most of them. Can I name 3 things about each president? And you know, and that's where you're like, wow, there's a lot of presidents. You're like, yeah, Benjamin Harrison, he lived.
It's true.
Yeah, and so when I approach my episodes, I try to like really lean into like what are 3 main things that I want to explore, and then at the end, like recap. Here's 3 things to know, because you're right. There's so many people, and if you look at these recent guys, you know, like what would be the 3 things they'd be known for? You think GW, it would be like 9/11, Iraq War, the start of the financial crisis, perhaps. You know, and if you look at Obama, you probably look at trying to get out of the financial crisis. You look at Obamacare. And then you might look at like just the Tea Party thing, like the swirling, changing of politics around him, that he was the center. Oh, first Black president, of course, too.
So that's the only thing that I think would put Barack Obama on that list.
100%, actually, yeah. Obama will always be remembered first Black president. Now, people might then say, what did he do? And they'll be like,
exactly. But then, so now that you've done all this research on these presidents, how many of them in there were those 3 things you were like, yeah, I don't really care to know those 3 things anymore.
Yeah, it's you know, everybody's kind of got their own threshold of what's fascinating. And probably even now, like if I look back at a lot of these 19th century presidents, so I just got through doing them, and you were to put me on the spot and say, can I name 3 things about each of them? There's some of them be like, damn, what were my 3 things on those guys? You know, there's a lot of guys who it's easy to slip through, even if sometimes it's monumental stuff. It's monumental stuff that maybe seems boring today. You know, like you might say,
like an infrastructure bill. It means a lot, but I'm not going to remember that.
Okay, so here's what shocked me: early American history. It's all about friggin' banks and tariffs. And and when I started getting into this, I'm reading these books. I'm like, okay, they're talking about the bank again. Get to something interesting. And it's like, no, it's just like the U.S. bank. Like, oh yeah, we got to make one. We got to kill it. What are the repercussions of that? Or tariffs? Should they be high? Should they be low? Like. That is such a huge part of that early, and now you look at it kind of like you said, infrastructure bill. You're like,
cool. I often think about like when the country started, and our first few presidents and everything, and you think about like, oh, all right, they're president, but there's a lot more to it than that. Like they were starting a country where they were literally going to get murdered for what the fuck they were doing. Like that gets a lot more interesting when you think about it. Like, I'm sure have you watched John Adams on HBO?
Yeah. I watched a good chunk of it, and I read the book that, you know, kind of inspired it.
I haven't read the book yet. I'll have to do that. But you know what I mean?
The Adamses are fun, by the way. What I want to see on like the History Nerds channel is a sitcom called Everybody Hates John Adams. That's what I want to see.
A lot of people that hate John Adams.
They all hate him.
It also painted Ben Franklin in probably a more truthful fashion, but one you don't often hear.
Yeah.
And that he was just a playboy dick.
He was a total playboy.
Like he was like just an asshole.
One of the most influential members of the media, members of the press of that time in U.S. history was one of his illegitimate children who was, if I remember right, like a hardcore supporter of Jefferson, out there, and just writing like slanderous stuff. And he was like, yeah, I'm a illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin. This is my thing.
And that's the thing. Yeah. Ben Franklin in that show, and I had to look it up afterwards. Be like, is this actually truthful? And you're like, oh fuck yeah, it is.
I feel like the times in history back then, you're like that was wild, and it's easy to remember. But anything from like, I don't know, maybe the late 1800s up until Nixon, it just almost didn't exist. Like most people don't really think about any of that.
People will be like, okay, there were a couple world wars in there. And other than that, they won't really know. Like Nazis were bad. I hope they got that down. But I mean, I've met people, you say until Nixon, I met people who have been like, what's Watergate? And I'm like, what? Did you go to school?
Well, I can understand that with like the younger crowd, because why would they even hear about it that much now?
It's still like the biggest scandal. Like I, for some reason, learned about Teapot Dome. I still have trouble explaining what it is, but it was in the textbook. I remember. Watergate at least got a movie. I mean, you got Dustin Hoffman in there. People should watch that. It's good.
They should, but
there's no movie about Teapot Dome. That would be boring.
I don't even know what that is.
It was the kind of illegal selling of U.S. government land that had oil under it to companies, and then the guys who sold it got kickbacks.
Now, what time frame was this?
This was Roaring 20s, during the short.
Oh yeah, a lot of really shady stuff going on then. Yeah.
Which presidency was it? I didn't get to hear.
Warren G. Harding, who was around for like 2 years, and then he died of like a massive heart attack in San Francisco. Nice.
So he did a lot of illegal land selling to corporations. Does that mean that he was? Oh, he didn't do that?
Yeah, sorry. His cabinet members and their underlings did. Yeah, just to be clear, Warren Harding, apparently a nice guy. Let's be nice to him. But he, in fact, there's a quote from him of something like, my enemies I can handle, but my goddamn friends.
It's true.
Yeah. So that sparks an interesting thought here. I'm going to ask you to put a finger on this here and tell me exactly which president is responsible for the massive amount of corporate corruption that we have now. How did that happen? Who did this to us?
I don't know that you can point to a president, but it has certainly been a slow unwinding by many presidents of legislation that was put in place during the progressive era. And like from TR through FDR, you kind of start being like, okay, this economy is not working. How do we tighten it up? How do we create social safety nets? How do we prevent like over speculation? And then it was like people of both parties, like Clinton in the 90s, there was this moment of Democrats even like saying, oh, let's deregulate. Maybe deregulating is a good thing. Generally, it's been Republican presidents, each one kind of taking a brick off of the wall that you might call regulation. But even Clinton was getting into it for a little while there. And then every individual senator, every individual congressman, who kind of went along with it. And it's funny because I a lot of people, they think of regulation as something that gets in the way of the American person. I feel like regulation, that's getting in my way. I like to think of regulation as something, good regulation, that keeps the corporations from getting out of your way. That a good regulation might prevent a bank from giving you a credit card deal with a super like obstruct, like obnoxious, clauses that you're never going to read that rips you off. It's, good regulation will stop Wells Fargo from opening 5 accounts in your name, and now you don't have to deal with that because the regulation got it out of your way. So I think that's still not how people think of regulation. People tend to think of regulation as it's something in my way. But you're starting to see a pushback at it. I think there's things that Biden wants to do, certainly, that will start to get the corporations less involved. And who knows, maybe even you might see on the Republican side, it's there's just certain like echo chambers. And like we were saying earlier, what are the issues people are going to vote on? People are voting on guns, God, on abortion, on that kind of stuff. And so these other things are being eclipsed. And so that makes it easy to keep either unwinding or just hold the line and then unwind more later when you get the chance.
We almost need another Teddy Roosevelt. He was the one big one who went after corruption like hardcore.
Absolutely. And the thing was, how did TR become president? Totally by accident.
He was the vice president, and the president was shot, wasn't it?
Yeah, McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist who was pissed. At a time of great inequity, an anarchist shot McKinley, and then TR became president. And TR was only vice president because the New York political bosses didn't want to be New York governor anymore. And they're like, let's put him in a vice presidency where nobody will ever hear from him again.
Yep.
So it was a fluke like that. But even too, there was also more of a groundswell. You had more third parties back then. You had progressive parties that were being organized. And it's really interesting because it's not in ways you think of today. Like the progressive parties back then were farmers. Like the People's Progressive Party was an alliance of farmers in the Midwest. You know, it almost could have been a national force, but the northern farmers and the southern farmers couldn't agree on whether to allow blacks into the lodge houses or not. So that kept it from being a national party. But you don't have that as much today. You know, people are more sticking with their parties. They're more sticking with their big shiny issues that are distracting them, and they're distracted from the economic issues.
They're entrenched in their parties. Yeah,
they're entrenched in their parties, and also the quality of life is just better. You know, back then America led the world in workplace accident fatalities, at least the Western industrial world. You know, it was there were slums everywhere. You know, it was very clear that the quality of living for so many Americans was awful, and that made it easier for them to band together and say, we need to do some progressive reforms, progressive changes, need to dial back the freewheeling corporate attitude where companies can do whatever they want, get away with murder. You know, today, most Americans, like we were talking earlier, houses are expensive. Yeah, that sucks. But we still got like, you know, a couple TVs, a phone. We can play games. Our football team, maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. You know, we got all our quality of life is so much better than it was 100 years ago. Yeah. And so it makes it much less likely that you're going to have a mass American movement who's upset, even though like the rich that disproportion between rich and poor is like as wide as it's been since that Gilded Age. The poor are better than they were last time. And so they're more likely to be content and not push as hard. And if the rich are fantastically wealthy, we've all convinced ourselves, oh, that might be us one day. So
the other thing I find interesting from TR's time is he was a Democrat, but his beliefs were almost Republican. And it seems like
no, he was a Republican.
He was a Republican that was more Democrat, and everything switched, right?
Back then, the Republicans were the Progressive Party, but I should say part of the Republican Party was the Progressive Party. There was even a faction that's split off of them at one point called like the Mugwumps, who thought the rest of the party wasn't progressive enough.
They were like the Whig Party or something, right?
Whig Party was earlier. The Mugwumps, but they were like I don't even think the Mugwumps ran as a party. They were just a group of people who were upset. Some of them voted for Democrats every now and then if they thought the Democrats would deliver more change. Neither party really had this grasp on progressivism. Both parties were trying to grab it, but then not necessarily trying to do anything with it because the corruption was so obvious. So you'd have folks like Grover Cleveland, who was the one Democrat like in that era. And he looks very much like a modern day Republican, where he was like, my version of progressivism is to cut government spending, because we cut government spending, we're cutting government corruption. You know, we can't be corruptly spending money if we're not spending money. And so he was just like that. He passed more vetoes than any other president, like in a single term. The guy was like the king of vetoes. Yeah. But he also refused to do things that you might look today as progressive. For example, there was a push. There was no welfare state back then, no social safety net. But there was a push for pensions for Union War veterans, which when you think about it, when like so many people fought in the Civil War, that's basically a social safety net bill. And Cleveland vetoed it every time. You know, the Republicans were the ones who passed it. So each party kind of had ways they were progressive. They had ways they were conservative. It's a messy thing that doesn't necessarily line up with today or even with each other. You know, from one candidate to another, you might have pretty radical shifts back then until it kind of settled into the current, you know, the Democrats are the Progressive Party and the Republicans are the Conservative Party.
It's interesting.
Now, what's the deal with the hard line on the parties now? I mean, when this country was started, that was not the intention, was it?
When the country was started, no parties at all was the intention. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Nobody intended for there to be parties. And then they just kind of like formed on their own. And one of it is actually, I think it's one of these things that you look back to George Washington. The first two parties form because Hamilton and Jefferson hate each other and they're in his cabinet and they can't get along. And while they're both these very talented people, I do wonder, like, was this a one failing that we might look to on Washington, in that he didn't create a shared vision for the country that could allow us to be more of, instead of having these two very opposite visions, could he have created a unified cabinet? Could he have, established the norms better? Because it very quickly got incredibly vitriolic back then. But yeah, no, parties weren't supposed to be the norm. It's also very weird that the United States has largely been a two-party system place, when all these other countries have multiple parties. It's quite an interesting fluke that we tend to be a two-party place. And, one of the things too, is you look back then, like, they didn't have secret ballots. That's one of the things that I think is crazy. Back then it was, you went in, well, first off, if I'm just out here, I'm the voter, I'm trying to decide which way to vote. I see both of you standing on the street. One of you is holding a Democrat ticket. One of you is holding a Republican ticket. And I literally take it from you and I walk into the voting booth and I give it to them. So it's incredibly public back then. Like, everybody knows how everybody's voting. And that creates like some real structure. And the secret ballot doesn't come until much later. But yeah, that was a bit of a ramble to your question, but no, nobody wanted these parties.
I think, our solution at some point is going to be more, because I don't think you can get rid of the parties. I don't think that's
You'd
possible.
have to have major systemic change, because the parties at this point, kind of like back then, the parties, they protected themselves. They locked themselves in by being organized and having these printed tickets that, you had to get your ticket. But new parties could get in just by printing their own tickets. So in some senses, it was easier for a party to get in. Now, everybody goes into the voting booth and they vote on the ticket they provide. And the states, both parties working together, have made it very hard for other parties to get on those tickets. You need like all these signatures. You need to get in by a certain date. Each state is different, but it's much harder now for third parties, for independent parties, to get onto ballots.
But I think that's the only way you're ever going to get out of, like, we're so divided now, is there's going to have to be more parties that actually have a fighting chance.
Yeah. There's other things too. Like, for example, get rid of the primary system. The primary system certainly encourages people at the extremes. They're the ones who show up for primaries. And so you tend to get more divisive candidates who then advance the general election. So if instead of a primary, each party doing its primary, what if each area, kind of like what you're saying, like, we're not necessarily saying get rid of the parties, but we're just saying there will be one election for this Congress seat. Everybody come out and vote on who you want. And you could do something like ranked choice voting, even perhaps, like, here's my number one, here's my number two, here's my number three, here's my number four, and then start eliminating from the bottom. Like, if my number one didn't get enough votes to qualify, like, he's obviously everybody's least favorite. Okay, go to who's my number two. And there's other systems that exist. And I think that's kind of what you got to do to start to eat away at it. People will still print their party identification on their sleeve. There's other things like taking money out of politics. You could try to do that. Imagine if the United States was a place where all elections were federally funded.
Yep.
And nobody's allowed to donate to campaigns. Yeah. No one's allowed to donate to campaigns. If you want to contribute to democracy, you can contribute to the democracy fund. And from that fund, every candidate, gets an equal amount of money. Yeah. And we all got public access TV and radio. We'll do debates on there. And like, that's how you can do something like that.
The whole election process in general is broken to me, though.
It's very broken. There needs to be systemic reform.
Yeah. Even you just look at what we've got through cable now, the way we, they get 60 seconds to talk about something. That is not enough to do anything. Right? Yeah. You can't even take a shit in 60 seconds and actually feel fulfilled about it.
Yeah.
Like,
and with TV too, you look back to the 80s when Reagan, if I remember right, it was like the fairness doctrine or free play on the air. Like, until the 80s, you had to treat both sides equally and fairly, give them both a chance to talk. Now you don't, And so that's allowed the news channels to really diverge. And instead of like back then, people kind of, all hearing the same thing, but the news channels had to be balanced. Now you can have channels that really cater to one side or the other.
Even in the 80s, I remember when that first happened, the news channels really weren't balanced. They just didn't like jump off the deep end. right?
Yeah.
Like you knew if you were watching CBS, you knew it wasn't a Republican channel. It's just you didn't see much of the other side.
Yeah.
It was never balanced. No one was ever like, "Oh, this is unbiased. I like this."
You know, and it might just be everyone's expressing their own perspective on the world. You know, like as a former journalist, I like to think that the people at those levels can be unbiased, especially print journalists. I'm just gonna say I was a print writer, so I'm gonna be like, if you want to get your news, get it from the newspaper. If not the newspaper, then get it from NPR. And if not that, watch TV.
I want journalism to go back to what it was, like to where they had to fact check and actually had pride in what the fuck they put out and not clickbait and just garbage.
There's a lot of stuff on the internet that's just sad these days. Cable news is pretty like awful. Like even like a channel like CNN that tries to be middle of the road, they're not really interested in journalism. They're interested in making money. They're an entertainment channel. All those news channels are entertainment channels, you know. And
but even if you took the money out of it, you're not. I don't think you're gonna, like you say. All right, NPR is biased as hell. Like it doesn't. You're never gonna have it to where people are gonna trust it again. I don't think. I mean, no matter what, if you said, all right, hey, it's federally funded, okay, well, who's in office? They're gonna start. They're gonna think that.
So the thing with the bias and the perceived bias is there were some studies done, psychological studies once, where on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, actually, where a researcher got a news clip, showed it to a bunch of Palestinians, showed it to a bunch of Israelis, asked each side, like, is this fair or is it biased? And the Palestinians were like, that was totally in Israel's side. And the Israelis were like, that was totally in the Palestinians' favor. You know, I think there's a lot of perceived bias that people see that's not intended or possibly even not there. And I think that's a struggle. Like journalists, they're always trying to figure out how to handle that. You know, for a long time, it was both sides was how they handled that. You know, it'd be like, oh, well, let's just let the other person talk. But then you run into the trouble of, say, the two sides of the argument is, you know, someone who's like normal. I won't define what normal is. I'll say, let's call someone who's normal, and someone who is either a Trotskyite, you know, socialist down, like anarchist, or what if the other person's like a Nazi? If you're doing both sides journalism, then you give each person an equal chance to talk. And they're just like, well, that was an educational discussion. Thank you, Mr. Hitler and Mr. Stalin, for coming on today. We appreciate your time. You know, and that doesn't help anyone either. No. So journalists, they have to, at some point, start, you know, refereeing a bit, umpiring it a little bit. And if you do, people will think you're biased, especially, you know, if you're umpiring it in a way that doesn't fit someone's worldview, and they'll be like, oh, you're biased against me. But I mean, there is a chance that some of us are just wrong about things sometimes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It just feels like now everything's so far, like it's either, you know, you're all the way over there or you're all the way over there.
It does. And I feel like the internet.
If there's something in the middle, I haven't found it yet.
Yeah. My line for quite a while now is the internet was a big mistake. We never should have invented that. We're all going to regret it. Well, someday we'll be like, yeah, the internet, that we shouldn't have invented that.
That was a great test. We're all done with it now.
We're done with it.
You can take this away.
Yeah.
It's true.
Now, you'd mentioned the issue with the money that's in politics, especially when you're talking about running for president. Is that like something you can look back in our history and say, this is when that started to change? Is that like
I absolutely can.
Yeah.
William McKinley, where I am right now on my podcast.
That bastard. What did he do?
That bastard.
Thank God he got killed.
It was too late at that point. It was too late.
Shit.
Yeah. William McKinley is the first president where it really became clear that one of these candidates who's running for president is the corporate candidate and one of them isn't. And it's because on the other side, the Democratic Party had this major shift. The previous guy had been Grover Cleveland. Their next candidate was a guy named William Jennings Bryan. If you've heard of William Jennings Bryan, you've heard it mentioned that he gave the famous Cross of Gold speech. William Jennings Bryan, it's so weird. I'll try to keep this short, but basically a big part of the country back then wanted higher inflation. They wanted higher inflation because they owed a lot of money to the banks. And if you have higher inflation, then the value of what you owe the banks doesn't change, but you suddenly have more money in your pocket. So it's easier to pay the banks. So that's what they wanted. William Jennings Bryan was in favor of a policy that would cause massive inflation. The corporations didn't like that, though, because they depend on banks for loans. Rich people depend on banks for loans to them personally, so they can live even richer than they are. The bankers, of course, didn't want that. And so in this election, basically, McKinley, his campaign manager, this guy named Mark Hanna, whose nickname is Dollar Mark, he went around each company, each sector of the economy. He said, hey, if I've done the math, if the other guy gets elected, you're going to lose $1 million a year. So why don't you give us $500,000 and you'll come out ahead? Consider it like the price of staying in business, basically. And he kind of shook down like each of these things, and they made an insane amount of money. They made they raised 7 times more money than William Jennings Bryan did. 7 times. It was like $3.5 million to like $500,000.
And then Teddy Roosevelt came in and just obliterated a bunch of them.
Oh yeah. Dollar Mark was so pissed when TR got on the ticket. When TR was nominated for VP later, Dollar Mark was like, "Are you insane? Do you realize he's 1 life away from the presidency?" Yeah,
because he got rid of what? Like he hit coal, he hit railroad. What else?
Yes.
He had a whole a bunch of them, but they were like the biggest of the big at the time.
Yeah. He
like
was
the Tesla and Amazon of today.
Absolutely. He was like, I will break up some of these big trusts. He also came down in labor disputes, like coal miners. That was a labor dispute. Should the coal miners get a raise or not? Until that point, if presidents got involved, it was to send federal troops to break up a strike. Teddy got involved and he said, nah, let's get a deal that works for these coal miners. And so that was a huge, like massive change. But it's funny. Yeah. McKinley, he's the guy that gets more money in politics. And from there on, people realize, like, if I can be the more corporate, candidate, I'm going to just raise way more money. He also ran like a modern campaign. They sent out literature to every American. They had certain households identified as more influential, so they sent more literature to them. Whereas William Jennings Bryan, all he could do was like go around on the train talking to people. And from that point, it's the big money's in politics.
Downfall.
Yeah. And TR, he tries his best. And it's funny because right after TR, the first progressive president and the rise of the progressive era, these two things happen right next to each other. And then they continue to develop like in this really weird symbiotic way alongside each other.
I mean, can you imagine if nowadays when a presidential candidate had, all right, you have this much funding, this much airtime, it's all allotted, like this is what happens. You don't get any more. That's it.
Yeah.
Oh, life would be so much better.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to kill myself every election season.
Yeah.
So a lot of the presidents are not going to be memorable in 100 years, like you said, but a number of them had a serious cult of personality. They're very memorable and they're really divisive. Looking back, what do you think, like what presidents made a lot of these big decisions, and what were those decisions that got us here to this modern system that we're living in?
Are you talking kind of political evolutions?
Yeah. So because we're talking about presidents, we know now we know how money got into how corporations got into
I'd say
campaigns.
Yeah, I'd say one of the guys right at the start, Thomas Jefferson, third president, the way he used the media. I mean, he organized, he created the partisan system. He created politics, he did it. He was the first guy that was really using all that stuff right. Also the first guy, you're talking about cult of personality. Jefferson was a master at that. Holy smokes. This is a guy who lived on this giant plantation tended to by slaves, never really had to work a day of his life. This is why he has so much time to sit around and invent swivel chairs and things like that. And he convinced the American people that he was just like an everyday schmo, more like them. And that John Adams, who lived on like the family farm and still went out and built fences and milked the cows, that John Adams was the symbol of aristocracy in America. Like, that is a masterful PR. So
I mean, John Adams didn't look the farmer look. I'll give him that.
It's true. John Adams, he like kind of played into it in the wrong way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Then he was snobbish. I mean, like we said earlier, everybody hates John Adams.
John Adams was an asshole.
John Adams was an asshole. So I'd say Jefferson was a huge influence. One guy who I talked about recently that I think is actually really interesting in kind of modern PR strategy is Grover Cleveland. A forgotten president by today's standards, but Grover Cleveland is the person who taught us how to survive scandals. And if anything, how to turn a scandal into a strength. When Grover Cleveland's running for president, a woman comes out and says, Grover Cleveland raped me. got me pregnant, locked me in a insane asylum, and sent the kid to an orphanage.
Nice.
And that's not very good. People are like, oh my God, how are you going to respond, Cleveland? Now, Cleveland allegedly told his staff, above all, tell the truth. I had sex with her. That's it. Everything else is a lie. And this modern thing that you'll see, like you saw any current politician, they'll be like, if I admit to like a little bit, but then deny the rest, that's how we get away with this. Like Grover Cleveland invented the playbook.
Weed, right? Yeah,
What's
but
that?
I didn't with Clinton with smoking
yes,
weed.
Clinton,
right?
exactly. I didn't inhale. Yeah, right. You know, and you can see it in so many things after that.
Yeah, Trump is a master at that. He's like,
exactly. I wasn't going to say Trump, but absolutely, he's a master at that.
Everything that someone accused him of. Yes, I did it, and it was the greatest. So let's move on.
Yeah,
every time.
So that would be a big one. Other big changes once you get to guys like in the 20th century, people start to use actual media more. Like Calvin Coolidge goes on the radio. You know, other people start using TV. You get to televised presidential debates with JFK Nixon. That's a huge, game change. We so see that as like a central part of the electoral process now. And it didn't exist before then. It didn't even happen. Like, I think if I remember, like it happens that election and then it doesn't happen. It happens again later.
Didn't Reagan bring back like talking to the American public on TV, or that he was the first one that used it thoroughly?
He brought radio back in a big way, if I remember right. I'll be honest, my research hasn't gotten to Reagan yet, and I was
he could be multiple.
I was 4 when he left the office, so yeah. But those would be some of the big change. I think you can also look at people who showed how you can expand the presidential power. Lincoln, in a time of war, he just did what had to be done, and he showed that if you do what has to be done, like people do it and ask for forgiveness later. That kind of approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So those are some big moments I would point to.
Yeah, it's interesting that because the times we live in, people like Trump and Obama are super memorable because they were so controversial, but they really didn't do a lot. Like Trump solidified division, but in terms of policy, he didn't really do a lot.
Yeah, it'll be hard to say. I mean, the one thing Trump did was tax cuts.
Mm-hmm.
But he built the wall, kind of.
Right. And he started building a wall that's already falling apart down on the border. And Obama, people remember him from Obamacare, but it already feels like that will be replaced by something else someday. The Democrats now feel like, and let's be honest, Obamacare was a Republican plan. That was him being like, let's take Mitt Romney's plan and maybe the Republicans will support me if I go behind a Republican plan. And they're like, no, we won't.
And Obamacare wasn't even that great of it. Like most people now.
No, we just never got finished.
Years are like, oh,
right.
This is
there were flaws that were kind of put into it by senators, and nowadays people either want like, get rid of it, go back to private everything, or we want fully socialized medicine. It's this awkward middle area that nobody's happy with. And sometimes that's politics.
I think it's a lot of times politics now.
Yeah.
I actually, on the subject of Trump and the wall, I had a conversation with someone who was saying that, when Trump was first voted in, he liked a lot of his stuff. And he was like, I like the wall. And I was like, why? What was it about the wall you liked? What was it ever going to do? Did you think that was going to stop them? He's like, no. Well, then why did you like it? I don't know. What the fuck?
Just didn't think China should be the only country that has one.
It was a wall and it meant something.
It never made a lot of sense. Even if you look at any walls that exist now, even when he was talking about building the wall, I was like, look at where it ends. It's the ocean. They just walk around it.
Right.
That's it.
Just walk around it, dig under it, go over it.
Have you ever seen the end of the Great Wall of China?
No.
Not the end. I've been to the Great Wall, not the end.
We'll put it up here. It goes out like 30 feet into the water. Like you could just get a boat. You could swim around the damn thing and you'd be around the Great Wall of China.
That's my point about the wall here. It's pointless.
Exactly.
Do you know who's going to be running next? Because there's all kinds of weird shit happening right now.
Yeah, it's hard to say. My prediction right now that nobody agrees with is your next Republican nominee will be Ron DeSantis.
That's
Trump.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with it though.
Yeah, he's the guy who's positioned himself. He's going on all the right places. He's getting the national exposure. He's basically playing that same red meat, playbook. He's delivering for that red meat playbook in Florida. He is positioning himself to be the next guy. I don't think Trump will run again. He'll just be really old. I feel like he'll be,
but I don't think he'll make it.
Yeah, like I don't know. And if he does run, it certainly does like freeze the whole Republican field. Yeah. And it creates a conundrum for DeSantis. But I'll say that I think DeSantis will be the next Republican president. The next guy that'll be him, whether it's in 2 years, whether it's in 6 years, I think, or later. He seems to be in position.
He'll be the candidate, that's for sure. I don't know if he'll make it a president, maybe.
Yeah, and then on the Democratic side, hard to say. Biden's getting old too. And
that was what I said when he first ran. I was like, how can he do that? He's almost 80.
It's funny, like the whole time he was running, everyone I spoke to was like, yeah. And then Kamala will take over. And I'm like, that's not really how this works.
It worked for Teddy. It worked for Teddy.
Yeah, it worked for Teddy. And Kamala, like, she's been so invisible. And I'm a news junkie, and I never see anything about her in the news unless it's a story about how like somebody else left her staff or they're unhappy there.
Apparently working in her staff is miserable.
Yeah. There's nothing good happening there. She's not, she hasn't been put in charge of anything, or at least she hasn't taken advantage of being put in charge of anything. It's bizarre. And then the question is who else from the Democratic field would run, all the other top names are also going to be people you say are too old. It's like, would Hillary run again? No. Would Bernie run again?
It's going to be a detached head on like the robot skeleton body,
which was fine. I'd vote for that. I mean, yeah. Or will it be someone new? Will it be like Mayor Pete running again, being like, look at the great job I did as transportation secretary, make me president, or someone else who like comes out of the blue. Elizabeth Warren, another one who will be, probably too old. Like the Democrats have a lot of old people. It's a struggle that kind of both parties have. And that's one of the reasons I point to DeSantis. The Republicans, if anything, right now have more young people that everybody knows.
Yeah, they're popping up right now.
Yeah, and the Democrats, what the Democrats need is they need all those people in the Senate to retire. All those like 80-year-old guys, they need to clear the way for some younger people so you can give the party fresh blood. Because when you think about the Democrats on the younger side, the ones you hear of are the ones who are so thoroughly vilified by the right that I don't think they'd ever have a chance with the middle.
The squad?
Yeah, the squad. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what I'm thinking of. Like those are the people you think of. You think of, all those women. And
you got AOC, you got...
Here we go. The members of the squad is, you have Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, AOC of New York, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, and Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts. I still, not on that list is my local congressman, Primala Jayapal. That's it.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about her.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And if anything, Primala Jayapal is more of a centrist of those from the press clippings I seem to be getting. She seems to be really being looked to as this leader, a young leader in the Democratic Party. And the part of Seattle she's from, she is not going to lose re-election. She is safe until she wants to enter the Senate or do something else. So that might be someone on the Democratic side, frankly, to keep an eye on maybe 10 years down the road.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of who I was thinking too, because by the time that Democrats can actually run again, in my terms, in my mind, like a successful campaign, it's going to have to be some of these younger people, because everyone else is going to be either dead or, eating through a straw.
There's no way Biden can get a second term.
He won't make a second.
Biden, if it was Biden versus Trump in a rematch, I think Biden would win that rematch. Trump's just got so much baggage.
Yeah.
He does, but even then, I think people forget it in the next 4 years. To a degree.
No way.
There was so much hatred constantly for Trump.
It's not like the last times a president was out of office and you just forget about him. He's still in the news all the time.
Yeah, the whole story would be: are we going to reelect Biden or the guy from the insurrection at the Capitol? Are we going to reelect Biden or are we going to end American democracy? Like that would be the storyline everywhere you looked.
I mean, he is like a cash cow to the media. It is pretty bad.
Yes.
Well,
It's just
if
like
you look
they
at
must
it,
be sitting there like, what do you do today?
every week though, something new comes out about his involvement with a lot of that shit. Like for the insurrection, last week I saw something where he was like he knew about it and intentionally pushed people to do it. And he was told by his cabinet, you need to tell them to stop. He was like, no, this is great. I'm not doing that.
Yeah, that's part of the text messages, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that is, the Democrats plus Liz Cheney and a couple of those, non-Trump Republicans who are like, we just want to make sure that doesn't become the party of Trump. And they're trying to just drip those stories, just keep those stories dripping, to make sure that he either doesn't get renominated or doesn't get re-elected.
I think that's a good idea, because having your entire Republican Party based around a single person instead of a political ideology, it's not really a great way to operate.
Yeah, it's funny because on the flip side, he's such a lightning rod that when he runs, it almost forces the Democrats just to run against him. Mm-hmm. And then you have that problem of the Democrats are running against Trump and not for anything.
Yes.
It becomes a perception. So that's the flip side of that. If you get a really divisive person running for president, then the other side suddenly feels like they don't have anything anymore. They're just not that person. And so it's like, okay, am I going to elect this person who has some things that I very clearly understand what they want to do, or just the people who say no to that? And that's a trap.
Yeah. I got a lot of that impression with this last race when Biden was running. Yeah, he talked about some policy, but a lot of it was, I'm not Trump. You should vote for me.
Yeah. Which is absolutely why the Democrats didn't win as many seats as they thought they would.
Yeah, I don't think they had to put up more than that.
Well, if they wanted to win, so they weren't in the situation they're in now, they should have. Because now everything they do is fought, and they barely squeak anything by.
Now they're all sitting there being like, fucking Joe Manchin.
Yeah, I'm sure that's mentioned a lot.
And so I don't know what your future aspirations are, Kenny, but let's say for a minute that you are going to be President Kenny Ryan. I'm tired of fighting over abortion and guns. What important issue are you going to kind of address with the country that is not those?
See, that's where I would fix all these really boring, unsexy systemic issues where, nobody would ever like remember Kenny, the president later, nobody would be like, oh, Kenny, like maybe I'll make ice cream free on Sundays. So I have like one thing people really like respect me for. But what the thing I focus on is I'd be like, okay, how do we get rid of gerrymandering? How do we get money out of politics? How do we fix the primary in the election system? How do we fix the Supreme Court? It makes no sense that there are people with life terms. Like the whole democracy thing was supposed to be to get away from that, to get away from this idea of people that are just there for life, creating like terms. And I think the whole court system can use a radical rewrite to where it is less partisan, to where it is out of the politicians' hands and more of just a strict like interpreting the law, So those would be the types of things that I would jump on. The really nerdy, the it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, I do all that, and then I would promise everybody free ice cream.
And just know 100 years after you, someone would be doing a podcast, be like, who the fuck fixed all this? Oh, it's Kenny.
I will say I like all your ideas except for one. Because of Nancy Pelosi, I have ice cream PTSD. So that won't work for me.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
It's not going to work on you. Well, if you decide to check out Seattle, Molly Moon's might change your mind. If you go to Austin, Amy's ice cream might change your mind. Best ice creams, like, oh my God.
All right. Well, I will definitely check them out because I'm going out west again this summer.
Do it.
But I think that's a great place to wrap it up. So, Kenny, before we go our separate ways, can you remind everyone again where they can check out more information about presidents?
Absolutely. You can find me on any podcast platform. It's Abridged Presidential Histories. I'm also on Twitter at APH Podcast. Love to see y'all there.
Awesome. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, guys.
So, Grizz, I actually learned a lot more than I thought I was going to hear, but something has come up recently since we actually recorded the body of this episode.
Something has?
Yeah, and I think it might make Biden a little more memorable than we thought he was going to be. Yeah. And that's World War III.
Do you think World War III is actually going to happen?
I
think it is, but not now.
I think it's got the potential to, at the very least, plant the seed for it. But the issues going on in Ukraine, if they devolve into something a lot bigger than they are right now, I think Biden's going to be memorable.
But even then, we talked about this in the episode, like just because they start a war doesn't make them always memorable.
No. And like Bush, he's not that memorable, even though he started a 20-year war. Comparatively, it's a low-level war that we've been in. But if Ukraine evolves into something beyond Ukraine and it triggers World War III, well, I take it back. He's not going to be remembered. We'll all be dead.
That's true. Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. New episodes every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe. Ofefe.
I am not a crook.